All right, today is June 22nd, 2007. I am Cassie Potasic, and it is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Knox, North Dakota. Can you please tell me your full name?
Elsie Ellen Mary Brick Black.
Okay. When and where were you born?
I was born in Devil's Lake on December 10th, 1924, at the General Hospital there. I'm the oldest in my family, and I have one sister who's 3 years younger.
Were there only two siblings in your family?
Two.
Have you ever heard an interesting story about your birth?
I had a very difficult birth. My mother weighed 90 pounds, and I weighed 10. So for a couple days they debated she would live or I would live. But we both ended up living.
Can you share your earliest memory with us?
I think maybe the first thing the first earliest one I remember is when I was 3 years old, my sister was born. And my dad's mother lived about a half a block from the hospital, so he was taking me over to the hospital to see the new baby. And the neighbor next door was kind of a witch. She didn't like children. She didn't want anybody walking on her sidewalk. And when I was walking along, I said to my dad, "You know, Daddy, they say she's a witch." And I think she was out sweeping, and he kept trying to get me to quiet down. He didn't want her to hear what I was saying. But it's what all the children on the block felt, that she was. And she was. She was hard for any of the neighbors to get along with. I think she was a widow. I'm not even sure because I never had much contact with her. I know she was an older lady. So.
You said your dad's mother lived about a block away?
About a half a block from both the grade school and the hospital in Devil's Lake. It's now a home for elderly people, a really nice living place for elderly people. They tore all the old buildings down and built that. Covers about a block and a half or more.
Well, can you tell me about your grandparents?
My grandparents, Brick, we always lived quite close to them. For a while we had an apartment in their home when I was a little older. When I was really little, my dad worked for the highway department, and at that time it was highway department, not Department of Transportation. And he maintained the road, the highway, between Devil's Lake and Crary. And so they would live in the summertime in Crary, and then they'd move into Devil's Lake in the wintertime. And sometimes they'd move to a little town called Keith halfway between, because he still did a lot of work with horses yet then, for grading or for cutting grass, that kind of thing. But after I started to school in a one-room rural school. There were about 4 or 5 little ones in my grade. And I was the oldest and hadn't had any of the childhood illnesses. So, of course, when they went around, I got it. And I got whooping cough so bad that I was out of school for like 6 weeks, that I couldn't, in first grade, in the winter time. And it was a really tough illness for children. But my sister then had it too, but she didn't have it as bad as I had gotten it. But then we had a tornado went through that area, and the place that we were living in, the house was saved, but all the other buildings were blown away. So we moved into Devil's Lake, and we lived in Devil's Lake until I was in 6th grade. So I went to Devil's Lake, and I went to a St. Mary's Academy, And for the second and third, part of second, I started second in that country school. And then we moved in, and I went to the academy for a year, but it was way out by the cemetery in Devil's Lake. And it was about 11 blocks that I had to walk, and I only lived a half a block from a public school. So when my sister started to school, she was never very well. And my folks said she couldn't walk that half mile because the cars didn't have headbolt heaters. And so in the wintertime, they'd put them in the garage and jack them up. When you needed it the most, you couldn't drive it till spring. So then I went to the public schools in Devil's Lake for fourth and fifth grade. And then when I was in sixth grade, my dad decided to go back farming, and we moved into the old town site that was Grand Harbor, used to be Grand Harbor. They expected when they founded Grand Harbor that would be the bigger town, not Devil's Lake, because it was on the lake, on the route for the mail, for the Mini H to stop, and Devil's Lake was a ways off the lake. But it didn't work out that way. For some reason, Devil's Lake continued to grow, and Grand Harbor just eventually disappeared. But when we lived there, yet the jail was still there, and a hotel was still standing, and a garage that had some old cars in it. They were not fairly nice cars, but during the Depression, the man who had them in the garage in Devil's Lake had taken bankruptcy, and they were just left. I don't know why they stayed there till, I suppose they tore the building down. But I remember we used to go in there and play in them because the buildings were all open. Everything was open. You could go into any of them. There was a blacksmith shop yet, and part of the post office. And there were two families that lived there. There was another family lived about a block from the house that we lived in, and we lived about a block from the school, the Grand Harbor School. And I went there for grades 6, 7, and 8. And then I went back to Devil's Lake to high school and graduated there in 1942. Then that fall of 42, I went to college in Minot to get an elementary. You could get an elementary certificate to teach in 1 year and 1 summer. It was 60 quarter hours. And so I got a certificate to teach, and I went to Berwick, North Dakota by Towner, and taught 2 years there until I had my standard certificate to teach. And then I got a life certificate. And that fall in 1945, I went to teach in Minot. I taught at McKinley School in Minot for 4 years. 2 before I was married, 2 after I was married. And then we decided Joe wanted to go on a farm, so we moved up by Bantry and lived on a farm there we never stayed in the winter because the house wasn't equipped for winter living. We just lived there during the summers and moved back to Minot in the winter time, where our oldest child was born in 1950. Jolene was born, and then we bought the farm here and moved here, and we've been here ever since. And Cindy was born here in 1953. I have 2 children, 2 girls. And Jolene got her bachelor's degree from Minot State. I got my bachelor's degree in 1970. I took classes in between, but I didn't stay with it. And went a lot of summer schools till I graduated. And then she graduated. She went to Wolford to school and graduated from Minot State with a bachelor's, and then left with a plane load of young people to teach in Australia for 3 years. And she taught 2 years in Australia. She taught music, and her roommate, her girlfriend, taught art. Her roommate was a doctor's daughter from St. Paul, Minnesota. And they taught there for 3 years, and then they went to New Zealand. They went every holiday. They went somewhere in Australia. They put the car on a train and went over to Perth, And then they had to have rhubards put on the car. You can't drive a car in Australia without rhubars on the outside for the kangaroos that are like deer in North Dakota. And they stopped at different places. And when they got there, she had her car, and they drove her car around Perth for that holiday. But they loved New Zealand and went back there and worked and stayed there for a year. And then Cindy was graduating from Minot State that year. And they spent the whole year traveling to Bali, Kuala Lumpur, India. They spent 6 weeks traveling around India. And then they went to Japan. And then by that time they were getting pretty broke. So they found jobs working, and they worked. And it happened that one of our neighbor ladies had gone to school at Minot State with a man from Japan. And he was quite an influential man. So when they got to Japan, he found them a place to live, and he found them this job that they were working with. And they were there for a month or six, or a couple months, till then she came home. They came home in the spring when before graduation. And when they were in Japan, they went out skiing one day with a ski instructor that didn't speak any English, and they didn't speak any Japanese. But they learned, they went a little downhill skiing, learned some of the beginnings of skiing in Japan. And the place that they worked in was a place close to the onion fields. And a lot of the farmers off the onion fields, or the men that worked on the onion fields, used to come into the place that they worked, and apparently their bodies absorb that smell of the onions after they've worked with them so closely all the time. I suppose at the end of the day it would be on their clothing and everything. So then she came home, and she needed money, so she went to teaching again. She had not taught in the country, in this country at all. She taught a year at Wolford, and then she went to college in Denver and got her master's in musical performance. And then she worked in Denver. She taught school in Denver till she got married. And when she got married, her husband worked for AT&T, so he let them. They had an opportunity with the company that they could go to the city of their choice in North America and work for AT&T, and AT&T furnished everything. Had a beautiful apartment right down on the lake, and they rented a new Buick for them to drive, and all of their furniture. They went to the furniture store and got to pick out what they wanted in new furniture that the company rented. And then if the living was more expensive in Chicago than it was in Denver, they gave them extra for that extra cost of the food. But they couldn't rent their house. They had to let just somebody live in it. So she let one of the teachers that was single and didn't have an apartment, that he lived in their house for 2 or 3 years that they were in Chicago. And then she never went back to teaching. She's worked now at other jobs in Denver. She worked as a Kelly girl for a while. That was interesting because every day it was a different field. And she worked some days in the registration office where they issue driver's license. And some days she worked down with the street vendors. They have little carts in all of the big malls downtown. And she worked with that. She liked that. She thought that was fun. And then she went to work at the Founders in Denver, which was a man who is in the Norwegian Hall of Fame in Minot, one of the first ones, because he donated to the Norwegian Heritage Society. And she worked for him. He had come here from Norway when he was a child, and had, with a friend, when he graduated from college in Wisconsin, went into the business. It was stocks, selling stocks and bonds and annuities and all of the different loan things. And he built up his business, and it covered a city block, the building. And then he sold it out to one of the big banks in the country. And she worked there for a while, but she never liked it anymore when it wasn't owned by someone locally that checked on it. And now she's been working for the state and the counties with the welfare programs. She has a crew of 12 people that work for her, and they go from office to office, whichever county needs special help, to get caught up when they're way behind with their patients that they can't keep track of. And that's what she likes that. She's still doing that. And her husband now has a master's degree in computer science. Got that when it was just coming in, and now a lot of those jobs have gone to India. So he took early retirement for AT&T, and he's working for an insurance company right now, doing computer programming, setting up websites and so forth. And but he's going to school at night to get a second master's in counseling. So he's going to go into counseling. He has done that. He did that for AT&T also. He didn't have a certificate, but he just helped in departments where people weren't getting along together, to go to help them to iron out their problems and get it straightened out. So he has a year of internship left, and then he will have that completed. And I hope he likes that, getting into that. So, and then the younger daughter finished college and married a man that she had met in college. He teaches at the University of North Dakota of Minot, in Minot, communications and stagecraft, speech, classes like that. And she has finished school. She got her degree in 1975 and went to teach in Carrington for 2 years. And then she went to Minot, and she's been teaching in Minot now ever since. And they have the only 2 grandchildren we have. Jared is the oldest. He has gone 2 years to NDSU. He'll be in his 3rd year. And the daughter is starting this fall at Minot State. I don't know what she's going to get. She hasn't decided yet. She said maybe something with communications, but it's a job, it's new. I haven't heard about it. I don't know what it is. When I went to school, girls were either a nurse or a secretary or a teacher. That was about the only 3 things there was to go into. And some of the girls in high school my friends wanted me to be a nurse. And I don't mind being stuck myself, but I don't like the sight of somebody else's blood, and I couldn't handle it. I can't even handle sitting in a film about the inner workings of the body. I can't handle that. So I wanted to be a teacher, and that's why some of the girls went to Valley City, and they had a ball. They went on the Galloping Goose from Devil's Lake down, a little old bus that took them down. But I went to Minot because at that time there were 2 trains that went east and west every day, and a Greyhound bus. So I could always get to school on a bus or a train and home again. I didn't have a car. So I didn't have a car till I had taught. In fact, I didn't have a car till we were married. I didn't own a car. And that was Joe's first car, too, when we bought it. He had used his dad's before that. But that's when. But so Cindy is teaching in Minot. She has the 2 children. She still teaches 2nd grade at Washington School, which is going to be a new school this fall. They're in the process of moving into it. They said first it would be Christmas, and when she packed away her Christmas things, she thought, well, I'll throw what I don't want. I'm not going to take it to a new school. But now they said they might be moving into it in August. So before they left, all of them packed up everything. The rooms are packed and ready to go on a truck out to the school if it gets done in time. The classrooms are pretty well finished, so they might be able to move the classrooms in. But the gym and the office and the lunchroom, our multi-purpose room they're going to use it for, isn't done. They're still working on that. So they don't know and won't know till school starts, where she unpacks or if she just stays packed and gets moved into the new one. But they're hoping, because it's going to have thermal heat, and it will and also be cooled. So that in warm weather they will have cooling, and they will have this thermal heat for the winter, and new playground equipment, and she's just looking forward to getting into a new building. The building they taught in was there when I taught in Minot. There were 3 buildings that were older, and there are still 2 standing, but Washington they're moving out of, and then Roosevelt was built too, I think in the 30s somewhere, and that one they're still using. But this, it's a beautiful building, but it's steps everywhere. All the classrooms on different levels, and it's just stories high. And so they're going to enjoy this new one, all on one level, and closer to everything. So it'll be nice for her. So that's my story. Most of it, anyway.
Well, how about we talk about the older generation of your family for a while?
Oh, yes, I started on my grandparents, didn't I? We lived in the same house as my grandmother, Brick, did, Grandma and Grandpa. And she rented out part of her house as part of a living, part of the rent paid for her living. And so I remember going over in the evening and standing on the rocker while she read me the funny papers before I could read. And then when I got old enough, of course, I could read it for myself. And then when we moved out to Grand Harbor, I had to stay in town in the wintertime. In the summertime, we drove. A bunch of other kids from the same community. We all drove together. But in the wintertime, I spent my freshman year staying with Grandma, and went to school and helped her with things at home, ran errands for her, and helped with whatever housework I could do. But in that house that she had lived in one room of her house, one bedroom, she rented out to a Civil War veteran. He was a man who was born in Indiana or Illinois, I believe, one of the two. And his brother was a doctor, a medical doctor. And when the war broke out, they didn't like the way the North was handling things. So they stole across the lines at night and joined the Confederate troops. And they were taken prisoners, both him and the brother, and put in that prison down south. And they had stories he used to tell us, and I wish I had written them down, all of the things that he lived through. But he had told us of once in the prison, they had prisoner exchange. The Union would exchange prisoners with the South. And they had been starving. They'd been snaring rats to cook and eat. They were that hungry. And when they came in, the Union brought in barrels of crackers. They didn't come in little boxes like now. They came in big barrels. And I suppose in the stores they just took so many out of the barrel and put it into a sack or something. But they brought in these barrels of crackers and barrels of water. And his brother said to him, "Don't eat very many of those crackers, even though you're hungry." And before they got the prisoners exchanged, half of them had eaten so many crackers that they died from it. Their stomachs just kept expanding. And so when they were exchanging, the South was getting a bunch of dead people instead, a few that were living. But he never liked Lincoln. And so all the time I was growing up, I never appreciated Lincoln at all because of the things he had said about him. I mean, he was from the same area of the country, and yet he had such an intense dislike for the man. And now, after I went to college and studied American history more, I realized that he did a lot of good things for the country. But at that time, they didn't all feel that way, that it was the best, that it was handled the best, I guess. So it was it was interesting to have Grandpa Lawyer, but he wasn't a grandfather. He wasn't related. It was just a boarder with my grandmother. But everybody. And across the street on 3rd Street in Devil's Lake lived Judge Duell, who was a Union officer in the same war. They lived across the street from each other. They'd often get together and visit, but they didn't always agree on everything. They still had their own preferences. And I thought that they were right. Each one was right. But he had contracted consumption, they called it then, tuberculosis. And I think later in life I had spots on my lungs, and the doctors tell me anyone who had associated with those Civil War veterans very often had spots. They healed up. I mean, it was just that it's there. Will always be there, I guess. But my grandfather was a horse trainer. He had Clydesdale horses. Sometimes he had a Belgium. He had different kinds of stallions. And in the summertime, he'd take his stallions to the different farms to breed the horses. So they were born in Canada. My family left Ireland. Dad's family left Ireland in the early 1800s and moved up to Ontario, Canada, where they homesteaded. They don't call it homesteading in Canada. They have another word for it. But they homesteaded land. And from that time to this time, a son or a grandson is still farming that land for over almost 200 years now. They have been there. But with Grandpa's family, there were several children, and only one can inherit the land, so the rest had to leave. So he and my grandmother came here. He had another brother that went to Wisconsin, and the rest of the family stayed in Canada. One went up to. So there are no bricks in our relationship left here, except in Canada. I have a lot of relatives living in Canada. I didn't realize it till a lady called me about 2 or 3 years ago on a bitter cold day, and her name was the same as my mother's, Margaret Brick. And she said, "This is Margaret Brick," and I thought somebody's pulling a joke on me. It's, not kind of a cruel one. No, she was Margaret Brick, but she lived in St. Catharines, Canada, in Ontario, Canada. And she wrote the family history. I've got the book. It's been published, called The Bricks from Ennismore was the name of the book, and it's interesting. I also have my mother's book, but hers was written in this country, and they're quite different. The Canadians have more stories of families that were moving, and when she wrote and asked me, I just couldn't see how that would fit into the book, because I had my mother's already, and there wasn't anything like that in there. And I didn't realize it till one day I was cleaning out a drawer, and I had stuck a letter I had from my dad's older sister, that when they came here, they came in the fall, and they went as far as Lakota and stayed with relatives all winter long. 2 families lived in one house. Then in the spring, they took a team of horses and moved up north of Devil's Lake, from Lakota to Devil's Lake, which is quite a long ways. And that's where my dad grew up, on a farm up in Noonan Township. And in her letter she had told all these interesting things. And when I read it the first time, I didn't think anything of it, but I saved it. And the second time, when I read it after I had seen the books, then it made more sense. It's really fun to read. But they went through how they, 2 families in a house. I don't know how that would work for a whole winter, in the wintertime especially, when you can't get outside. But they did without a lot of things in those days. So, but I could have had that in the book, if I had known about it or remembered the story. Well, I could have. But my dad had one brother who went from Devil's Lake to Minneapolis to barber school. I don't know if there weren't any closer in North Dakota, but he went. My dad later on then went also to the same barber school in the Twin Cities. It was called the Twin City Barber School, I think. And but my uncle came home on the train, and he had spent all his money while he was gone. Typical young kid. And he had some nickels, and he bought a bag of peanuts, and he ate the peanuts. By the time he got off the train, he had a knot in his bowel, and they took him to the hospital, and he was running a temperature, and the nurse opened the windows to help him cool off, and he got pneumonia and died. He was only about 20-some years old. So then my dad went to the same barber school. His mother, he didn't want to be a barber. He wanted to be a blacksmith, but he was a small man. And his mother said, no, you're too small. She wouldn't let him go. She said, no, you go to barber school. So that's what he did. And when he came home, he's typical Irishman, and they don't like catering to anybody. So he went to work at a barber shop in Church's Ferry. And the man said, oh, when the customers are through getting their hair cut and a shave, you take their jackets and help them with their jackets and brush them off. And my dad worked one day, and he said, I'm not brushing anybody off. That's not what I want to do in life. And never went back, never ever worked another day at it. So he always said he wanted us to get an education, but he wasn't going to say what we had to do. We could go whatever we were interested in doing. So that's why I went off to college. And my mother was so homesick, she kept saying, let's go get her home. My dad said, nope, she's going to get that education. So I did, and I'm not sorry. So I taught for 38 years before I retired.
All right, can you tell me a little bit about your mother's parents?
Okay. I really don't know very much about my mother's parents. We didn't live that far away, but I never went to visit them very often. So I kind of missed out on that side of the family. I knew all the cousins, but my grandparents came from, they were born German and had gone to someplace in Russia and down by the Black Sea. And their whole family came, including my grandparents. They're buried at Devil's Lake. The grandparents and the children who were married, and some of her older brothers were born there. One of them was born on the way here before they got to the United States. And I think they came in through Canada too, I'm not sure on that. I've never known, I didn't get to ask. I should have asked, because I had one aunt that lived to be 96, just died about 2 years ago. And I had asked her questions about, things, and she was sharp as a tack until she died. So she would have known if I had thought to ask. But whether they came through Ellis Island, but someone claimed, I think the woman that wrote the history, said there was some childhood illness on the ship, and they wouldn't allow any of that ship to unload. And then they went to Canada, and then they took a train and came across and came down in North Dakota. Apparently they knew where they were going. And I've never heard that they went to South Dakota, because my mother was born at Towner, North Dakota. They lived there for a few years, and then they moved. At a time, a lot of them were migrating from that part of the state to the eastern, when it was dry. And they moved on a farm up northeast of Devil's Lake. And my mother and dad had both gone to the same country school. My dad was 3 years older than my mother, but they went in a country school. They're all 8 grades, they're all ages. And that's where they both knew, they lived neighbors to one another up in that country. There's a church up there that they went to, a country church called St. Benedict's, I believe. Now it's not used anymore. It's vacant, or somebody bought it. But the graveyard, that's where my great-grandparents are buried, and my grandparents are buried in the Devil's Lake Cemetery, where both of my parents are buried, not very far apart. And they farmed then, and the oldest boy stayed, and my mother left home right after she was through with grade school, and went to work and worked for my aunt. And that's where my dad and mother met. She was working, helping with the children and the farm work, not farm work, but the housework. That uncle, my dad's sister, had inherited, her husband had inherited a lot of land, and he had a huge farm. And they always had 9 hired men, 8 or 9 hired men. And so she needed help when her children were little because they did all the washing by hand in a washboard. And they always had hired some girl to help with the housework and the children. That aunt had a different heritage. I don't know. I've never understood. They lived on the farm. We lived in town, and I loved the farm, so I'd go out all summer long. The day school was out, I went out to the farm, and I stayed there till the day before school started, and I went back to town. But she had 9 children. Some were old. I was about the age of the middle ones. Some were older, some were younger. And these 9 hired men, so they had one whole room that had one huge table, where everybody could sit, and they cooked for all of these hired men. But at 11 o'clock in the morning, all of us would change our clothes. We'd all go get a bath and change our clothes into clean clothes for dinner. Dinner was at noon, but we cleaned up for dinner at noon. All of the kids, all of us, we did just by routine. When the clock was 11 o'clock, we all went and got our baths taken, got on clean clothes. Of course, the field hands came in from the field and just washed their hands and sat down. They didn't clean up, but all her life, her children always cleaned up for dinner, even though dinner was in the middle of the day, not at the end of the day. Like now, people have a dinner. And every other day she baked bread. And then one day they'd bake pies, and the next day they baked, a cake or something else. With all those people, one meal, and no matter what you baked, it was gone. Donuts, big pails of donuts. She had an outside stairway to go to the basement. We used to sneak down the stairway and get the donuts out of the pail. By the time she got down there to put them on the table, they probably were all gone. She had a lot of little ones to feed. But that's what my mother went to do. She worked on that farm until she got married. And then she got married when she was only about 19, I think, because I was born when she was only 20. So, but then my grandparents moved into Devil's Lake when they got older, and my uncle took over the farm. And any of those feed loans they had during the 30s, I guess the farmers got feed loans from the government. When they got having good crops again, they came back to whoever had taken over. So my uncle, who took over their farm, actually took over their loans that had to be paid back for things that they had been given during the bad years. And then my grandfather died of encephalitis, and when he died, then my grandmother didn't want to really live anymore. She only lived for about 11 months after he died, and she passed away too. She just had nothing to look forward to, I guess, without him. And he was a very passive man. He never, ever spanked any of his children. He always would say, "Do you want a butch?" which is a hit on the head. And of course they all said no, and he never did. And his wife went to town and did the business. She would go to town with the oldest son and sign contracts or buy whatever they needed for the farm, and he'd stay home and hoe the garden. It's just different. I can see that kind of a society more today where women are more active, but to do that 60, 70 years ago, I can't imagine the wife being the one to want to go in and try reading a contract or any business dealings like that. But apparently she made the decisions, and he went along with whatever she did. My mother said she never, ever once heard the two of them argue. Of course, he always gave in. That's the way to win an argument. I don't know what you did. It would be kind of nice to know.
Can you tell me their names?
Grandma was born Marion Hoffert with A-R-T, Hoffert, H-O-F-F-A-R-T, and Grandpa's name was Lambert Sheely, S-C-H-I-E-L-E.
And these were your mother's parents?
Pardon?
And these were your mother's parents?
Those were my mother's parents. Mm-hmm. My dad's parents were Frederick Brick, and Grandma was Mary Ellen Murray Brick.
Okay.
My dad's parents were both born in Canada, of course.
Can you tell me anything else about your grandparents? Anything you remember about your grandparents?
What about them?
Anything else that you remember? Any other
Oh,
stories?
I suppose I will remember it, but I'm not trying to. I'm not really.
Okay.
I loved my grandmother, but she was kind of a typical Irishman. She had favorites, which I don't think grandparents should do. And if she liked the grandchild, she was real good to it. If she didn't like a grandchild, you knew she didn't like you. She just wasn't, she didn't like my sister. She picked on my sister all the time, but I got along fine with her. She did, you know, like I said, she read me the funnies, and she'd do anything, you know. I had no problems with her. But my sister was different. She was always, she was kind of sickly when she was little, and I think she was just kind of a homebody. She just liked being with her parents. She never wanted to go away. Like I say, I went out to the farm and I stayed out there for 3 months and was perfectly happy till I had to go home. And she came out, I remember once, to stay overnight, and she bawled all night. Had everybody in the house awake, wanted to go home. And it's funny that Uncle Frank didn't come in and just take her home in the middle of the night. Now I think anybody would, but then it wasn't as easy to get a car started. And he waited till the next day, and then I think they took her home because she just didn't cotton to going away from home. And I loved all of the other children in the family, and they had all kinds of horses, and they had cows, and big garden. We used to go out and pick potato bugs off the plants and put them in a pail, pick a pail full of those bugs, and then put kerosene on them and fry them up so they were dead. I never minded any of the chores. And my aunt, when I was there, if they got disciplined, I got disciplined. I mean, it was just like another one of the family. I just felt right at home while I stayed there. And sometimes one of those cousins would go stay with my mother because she was alone all day. Dad worked, you know. Dad used to get up and go to work at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he worked till 6 o'clock at night. When the whistle blew, Dad came home. And he worked 6 days a week. Those long hours, 6 days, that's about a 72-hour week, I think. 6 days times about an 8 or 9 hour day or more, because he left at 6, came home at 6. So, but he did take his lunch with him. But
how many kids were in your dad's family?
My dad, there were 4 of them, 2 boys and 2 girls. And Dad lost his brother when he was only 20-something. And then he passed away when he was only 68. But his 2 sisters lived to be like in their 80s. They both lived longer. And one sister had 1 child. The other one had 9. So out of the 12 of us, my sister and I are the only 2 that are living. the aunt with all the children didn't know it until her husband was in midlife, and he was diagnosed with Huntington's chorea, and that's an illness of the nervous system. And it takes half of your family will inherit it. So of her 9 children, 4, I think, of them inherited that, and that's how they died, and they died quite young. And then Uncle Frank's sister had only 2 children, I believe, and one was a nun, and that one had it, and the other one got married, so their children didn't have it. That was the end of it there. But with Uncle Frank, some of those children had children. But I think now they have things they can do. At that time, there wasn't much of anything they could do. Your brain is always working, but you can't control the voice. You can't control all of the muscles in your body. So it's difficult for them to communicate with anyone. And yet they know what you're talking about. They know what you're saying. They understand what it is. So it's a horrible way to die. It's an awful death. So that one lost her husband when she was quite, middle-aged. But she always had a saying, I did what my mother told me to do for 20 years. Then I did what my husband told me to do for 30 years. And now I can do what I want to do. But I thought how sad you have to wait till you're older to have to be able to do what you want to do in life. You shouldn't have to be told what to do by anybody. You should be able to make your own decisions. And she was intelligent. She made up they all moved to California. All of my dad's relatives, his 2 sisters, moved to California in the 40s, or back in 1940. Well, Uncle Frank, the one that had the farm, his family had been in California, had moved from North Dakota to California, so he had family out there. Their family was, and all of those relatives that I have still live in California, but all of my cousins are gone. There's nobody left living. It's just their children that are living. And I haven't kept track of them. I don't know if any of them have this illness, or now they can take something for it. Better, it would be better.
Can you tell me the names of your father's siblings, their names?
Yeah, the oldest one was Aunt Ethel Brick Daly, Daeley. And Frances was Frances Brick Walker. She married Walker. And Aunt Ethel had the 9 children, and Frances only had the 1 child. And Dad had 2. Those 2 are my sisters living in Valley City. Married and lives there.
How about your mom's family? How many kids were there?
There were 8, I believe, in that family. Must have been like 4 boys and 4 girls, I think. But there were about 8 of them.
Do you know their names?
Pardon?
Do you know their names?
Their given names? All of them? Oh, I suppose. Yeah, I know them all. There was a Nick and Joe and Philip, and then my mother, and then Mary and Lena. Mary, Lena, mother, and Annie, and Andrew. The 2 last ones are Annie and Andrew.
Which was the aunt you stayed with?
Aunt Ethel Daly.
Were there any other of your aunts or uncles that you were particularly close to?
I used to stay with Uncle Philip and Aunt Emma on my mother's side a lot. We were there a lot. They lived on a farm right not too far from where Aunt Ethel lived, up northeast of Devil's Lake too. We used to visit them. They're both dead now too, have expired.
Can you tell me about your father?
Well, my dad was a typical Irish person. I always said I'd never marry an Irishman, and I didn't, but very good-hearted, and but what he said, you knew you didn't argue with him. I never argued with him that I know of, but he would always help you. And if he didn't like something, you knew it right now. He didn't tell the neighbor. He told the person he didn't what he didn't like. And if he did get angry, he'd get really angry, but only for a few minutes, and then it was over. It was over. It came out, and he forgot about it. You never heard it again after it was kind of ironed out. But he and my mother did so many things together. When she house cleaned, he helped. Washed walls, painted. And then if he needed help, then she went out and helped him with whatever she could do. But they did a lot of things together because they were quite young when my sister and I grew up and left. It was just the two of them. They loved going to auction sales. They went to every auction sale. Not that they bought anything. They just went to eat some barbecues or whatever they had for lunch and visit with the neighbors, see who else was there. It was just kind of an entertainment to them. And sometimes he found things they needed or could use, and they did bring it home. I'm not an auction person. I've never gotten a card to bid. And the last time I went, a friend of mine in Rugby sold her household things. And Joe had a card, and I told him, I want you to get me things. And she had a collection of nice teapots, and I wanted a teapot so badly. And every time, so he'd get around to saying his number, the teapot was sold. I never got one. So I thought, I guess I'd better learn to do it myself. It's not hard to stick your hand in the air. They'll take your bid. But that was enough. But I have not gone to one since. So sometimes I think it'd be fun to go and look around. I like to go to garage sales and look around. I never buy much, but I like to look around, see what there's find. And I have bought some things at garage sales, cups, pretty cups, things like that. But that's not I don't do it as a habit. I don't go very often. But a lot of people do. A lot of interest in garage sales, I think. I've never had one. I'd be one way to clean out the house. When we house clean, I don't throw a lot out. I'm a keeper. So when my daughter comes home from mine, she's a thrower, and I end up with half of it in the garbage. Then when I want it, I can't find it anymore, but it's gone. She doesn't like to throw her own things. I have magazines up in her room with all the bride things, the bride magazines from 1977 when she was a bride. And every time she comes home, I say, aren't you going to throw those bride books away? Oh, I think I'll keep them a while yet. So I don't know if she just likes looking at the style, I guess, of 1977 or why she wants to keep them. But she did find when she looked through it some of her yearbooks from high school that she didn't know where they were. And they were in the box with those bride books. So it's a little easier to throw away somebody else's than it is to throw away your own, I guess. Something you want to keep. That's it.
Okay, when was your father born?
My daughter?
Your father.
My dad? My dad was born in 1901 in Lindsay, Ontario, Canada. And my mother was born on May 11th of 1904 in Towner, North Dakota.
Can you tell me about your mother?
My mother, she was kind of a reserved person. She was a home person, enjoyed her family. She had some close friends, but she was not an outgoing kind of person. She stayed pretty close to home. But I remember when we were little, it was just the two of us, and like she'd often leave her work and come out and play games with us. So we'd have three to play tag or play some of the games that we couldn't play, just the two of us. So she used to tell me to sit down and read to the children and go out and play with them. But I always had too much to do. I never had that kind of time. I rocked them, but I didn't. I read to them, yes, I believe in that. But I don't think I ever went out and played games with them or anything. I always had things I had to get done, I thought. So I didn't do that. My dad told us that the reason we have a lot in Devil's Lake at the cemetery, his uncle from Canada, his dad's youngest brother, was like 15 years old, and he and his dad came to North Dakota, and his father was thinking about leaving Canada and moving the family here. And he came and brought this son along with him. And the son got red measles. He'd never had measles. He became ill with red measles. And my dad was out, he was about 9 or 10. He was out snaring gophers in the spring of the year. And he came up to the bedroom window and he opened the window and he said to this boy, "Why don't you come out and snare gophers with me?" So this young man snuck out the window and went out hunting gophers, and he died of the red measles. So my great-grandfather, had to bury him here in North Dakota. So they buried him in the Devil's Lake Cemetery, and he bought a lot for 6 graves. Well, when he got back to Canada, his wife would not allow it. She wanted that body returned to Canada. So they had it exhumed and returned it to Canada. And then the lot was there, and that's where my parents and my grandparents, no, my grandfather is buried there, and Uncle Harold. But my grandmother, her daughter lived, the daughters both lived in California, and they put her in a mausoleum in California. So the two grandparents are half a continent apart, which is too bad, I think. She should have been buried here. There is room there. Would have been room for her to be buried, but Aunt Frances wanted her close, her body close, and that's why she is. And I don't know, the mausoleums to me are cold. You really can't do much with them. There's a little vase there that you can put a few flowers in, and that's about all. So it's, but it's too late to do anything about that. But it's strange that a young man, 15, hadn't had red measles while he was growing up. That's such a prevalent illness. But you don't go out and get cold when you're sick with that either.
Now, were there doctors available at that time for him to see?
They had him in the hospital. He died in the hospital in Devil's Lake. I suppose he started running a fever, and they took him into the hospital, but he still passed away. And when they wrote the history book, when that lady they couldn't figure out what had happened to him, why he died so young. And I remember Dad telling me the story of how he felt responsible because he had talked him into coming out, out to play. He called, snaring gophers. But apparently they'd put a little loop around the gopher hole with a string on it and lay on the ground and wait for the gopher to stick its head through and then pull the string fast and catch it and kill it. Sometimes they used to get a nickel for a gopher tail or something. Somebody paid the kids for snaring or getting those gophers. Otherwise, they had to put poison out. Other animals can get the poison, so this way they got rid of the gopher and nothing else got hurt. And that's why we have the family lot yet in Devil's Lake. in a real old part of the cemetery because it was one of the early graves there.
Can you tell me anything else about your mother?
Well, Mother liked to sew, and often she'd sew all our dresses so she could make real cute dresses and matching dresses. She always made, if she made for one girl, she had the other, made this one for the other girl too. We both had the same dresses. Oh, she just got enough material that she could make the two. But she did a lot of, she even made us coats. I remember some summer coats especially, that she sewed on an old sewing machine with a treadle, that she had to treadle. And my daughter has that. And she has a room with a room full of antique things. And she has that sewing machine there that she had. She did, and my dad sewed his canvases on it before he died. She couldn't have sewed anything decent on it anymore after that. But it really was a good machine. It really had good stitches to it. But it was, you had to keep pushing.
Okay, Elsie, can you tell me about your sister? What was her name?
Bernadine. She's 3 years older, 3 years younger than I am. And when we were growing up, I was always the large one, and she was always the kind of ill one. And she used to go to the doctor at least once a month to be weighed in because she just didn't seem to be growing. And then she got to be a junior in high school, and all of a sudden she just grew up. She was still, when she was a freshman and a sophomore, she's still wearing little girl's clothing. She just fit into a young preteen dress or stockings, and she had trouble finding clothes all of the time. But then she grew out of that, and she wanted to be a librarian. And my dad said, well, we both were supposed to go to college. He had put away the money, and he wanted her to go to a local school in North Dakota. She only wanted to go to one in New York City, and she wouldn't go to any other one. She just did not want to go and wouldn't go. So she never, to this day, and she never has said she regretted it until last spring when at graduation, I said to the graduate, oh, I'm so glad you're going to college because you'll get so much, not just knowledge, but you'll get living, outside things, other things. And then she said to him, it was her grandson, I mean. And she said, yes, that's the one thing I really regret, that I didn't go when I should have gone. She said, I've regretted it all my life. But she's also lived in a college city all her life and never taken a class. So if she really wanted, she would have started somewhere and taken some classwork. And once you get started, you're never too old to finish it out, no matter what the age. So I don't think it's bothered her that much. Her husband always had a good job, and she never had to work. She never worked outside the home. So she's never had a need for any education. She has 3 boys and 1 daughter. So I have 1 niece and 3 nephews. And one of them is married, lives in Fargo, and his family grew up there. His daughters are gymnasts. His oldest girl now is going into sports medicine. And the second one has her degree from the University of Utah. She went on a gymnast scholarship for her education. Now, this last year, she's working on her master's. I think she probably has finished the master's with the same kind of program. She will be working with gymnasts somewhere. That's all the family I have. 1 sister and 3 nephews and a niece.
Yeah. Well, when you were growing up, did you guys get along well?
Yes, I think we did, although we're very, very different. The only thing that's similar with us is our voices. When we both had married and had children, if we went to take care of one of them at night, they didn't know which one it was in the dark. They couldn't tell the difference. And when I answer the phone, I have an idea that we both sound the same. But I think we've started looking more alike as we've gotten older. We were nothing alike. She looked a lot like my dad. I guess I looked more like my mother. And but for the differences that we were and the difference in temperaments, we got along pretty good. I think. I don't know what it would be like to have a brother. I never had one, so I never had any around until we had a grandson. And that was a nice experience, somebody that played with cars. But they're very different, grandsons from granddaughters. The grandson always liked rough and tumble kind of things, and the granddaughter liked reading and watching television. And when they were learning to drive, he's still a little heavy with the foot on the pedal, and she is very cautious. It's just a different thing completely. But it's fun to have both. They've had a chance to have both grandchildren. And I'm glad they lived in Minot, not off in some other corner of the world where I wouldn't have seen them. I don't think you feel like a grandparent if you don't see them a lot. When they were little, they loved coming to Grandma and Grandpa's, but then they grew up and have a life of their own, and they still enjoy it. You still enjoy them, but it's not the same anymore as when they needed you, kind of, to come. So when my grandson was little, his mother was scolding him for something, and he said, "Well, if you're not careful, I'm going to run away from home." And she said, "Where are you going to run to?" He said, "I'm going to Grandma's." And she, "If you think you're going to get by with Grandma, you'll find out you don't get by with as much as you do with me." So he never did try it. He didn't take his little wagon and walk away like some little kids do. So I probably wouldn't have been quite as strict with him as I had been with my own. And it took my children. Jolene had to get clear to Australia when she finally wrote home and said she was glad we had been strict. We hadn't let her just run loose and do what she wanted. She had some friends that did that, and she thought we were tough. But after a while, she realized it wasn't so bad. But it took her a long time.
Well, when you were growing up, did your sister and you ever get into mischief?
Oh, yeah. I'll never forget one Christmas. We always got several toys. And every year until we were too big, we got a doll. Whether we needed one or not, we got a doll every Christmas. And one Christmas when we got up in the morning, there was under the tree, we had one of those sleds, those flyer sleds, and on it were two dolls. One was pink and blonde, and the other one was dark and blue, dressed in a blue dress. And I switched real quick and said to my folks, "Nope, I got the pink doll." And my mother kept saying, "Are you sure you got that pink doll? Are you sure you didn't get the blue one?" "Nope, I had the pink one." I lied for 2 weeks, and they couldn't break me. They couldn't make me tell that I had switched those dolls. I thought they didn't know who Santa Claus brought them, and they didn't know who had left which one which. But then finally it started working on me. They kept after me, and it finally started to bother me. But then I broke the head off the pink doll. I admitted that it wasn't mine. I don't remember getting punished for it because I think they were just glad I finally told the truth. But I remember that, trying to do something that was not right and learn from it.
So who was the stricter parent? Who would have disciplined you if you got in trouble?
Pardon?
Who would have disciplined you if you got in trouble? Which one of your parents?
That was one thing I never did. My mother would always say, "Wait till Dad gets home." And she did that all the time. So when my children got into trouble, I took care of it right now. I didn't wait to say, "Dad will take care of it when he gets home." I don't think it's fair to the fathers. That leaves them always the one that's going to give you the punishment. And he never punished us very often. I remember once I did something wrong. I don't remember. I was supposed to do something. When we moved to Grand Harbor, we lived on a dairy farm. And I was told to feed some calves or something, and I didn't do it. I was playing, and he came after me, and he gave me a swat in the butt. And I never forgot it. And that never happened again, but it was something that stayed with me, that you have to do what you're told to do and get it taken care of. But, no.
What was it like when you left the house and your sister was still there? Was it hard on your sister? Were you guys that close?
You mean when I left for college? Well, she was in sophomore in high school. No, I often think it was harder for me to be left home alone with my folks, even though I was only a baby when I was, the first one born. But for her, it was natural. She never minded being home alone with the folks. And I've noticed that with my daughters too. The first one, I think, is more uncomfortable when she's home alone. And the little one enjoys it. She's a whole, right back where she was for so many years. So I think maybe it's the order of birth, that maybe the position that you're in. I still, when I think about it, I wasn't real, and yet I was very, very close to my mother, much more so than I was to my dad. And Dad was surprised that because I never said much, to him. I never disagreed with him much. After my mother died, then I spoke up more. And he said to my sister one day, "Well, I never thought she would ever do that. She never did." And my sister said, "Well, maybe she's more like you than you think." That was the trait I had gotten from him, not from my mother. My mother was almost too easygoing. She lots of times should have probably disciplined more than she did, or with my dad made her wishes known. I don't want to do that. I don't like that. She never ever did. She would just kind of just adjust to it and get along. And I think we both have said her life would have been better had she spoken up more often, made her wishes known. If she ever did, he never argued with her, because when she did, it was so seldom that he right now knew there's no sense in pursuing it. Just let it go.
Were your parents very affectionate? Did they show their emotions?
Oh yes, I think they were affectionate to each other, very much so. They did get along well together, because like I said, my mother was kind of like her dad. She just kind of, unless it really bothered her a lot, or it was really something that she just absolutely didn't want, then she would speak up. But I think she was probably a little stricter with us girls. I remember the day I was getting married, she told me to do something, and I said something back. I don't remember what it was. It was early in the morning, and and she didn't like what I said, and I got a swat upside the head. And kind of, didn't bother me, but I thought, boy, it's quite a day to get a slap on the head, when I probably needed it more when I was little and didn't get it.
Do you have any other stories you'd like to share about your family when you were growing up?
No, my sister and I have different views of our early childhood. I always thought everything was fine. And if we didn't have a lot of money, neither did any of the neighbors. We all were in the same boat. But she always felt they could have done more, they could have given her more, we could have had the things that we didn't have. I never missed it. Nobody had it. Nobody had a whole lot of anything, And I think some of the larger families had to share what little they had with more than we had to share with just the two of us. So I think we were pretty lucky.
Anything else about your family? Anything else about your family?
No, I don't think so. I'll think of it tomorrow. That's what I usually do.
Yeah.
After everything's over with, then I'll think, why didn't I do this?
All right, then. of games did you play as a child?
Well, you know, I grew up most of my game playing time in town. And my sister used to ride a tricycle, and I had roller skates, and we used to do that a lot. In Devil's Lake, they had a post office that had a ramp built on the second story down. And we used to go over there and go down with our roller skates and go out, you know, go march back up the steps, but come down on that ramp. We used to do that a lot. And of course, I was always kids that lived by. One of my friends, her grandfather was the captain of the Mini H, Herman Nagel. And she and I used to play. They had taken the wheelhouse off of the Mini H when they quit using it on the lake, and it was in their backyard, and they had made kind of a playhouse out of it. So we used to play together in that playhouse a lot of times. Now they've moved the house away, and I think the wheelhouse is gone completely. It's probably in a museum out by Fort Totten. But I remember playing in it, playing house and playing games. And my sister and I played house a lot, and we used those old cars I mentioned in the garage where we lived. And we used to use the rooms in the hotel, the old hotel. It had two stairways, a stairway where the guests went upstairs, and a stairway in the back of it where you could carry up food, where the cooks would carry up food. And so we used to spend a lot of time playing in there. And that too, we had, the neighbors were only a block away. We could play together during the day. And we all went to the same school. So they had the old post office, and it had all the little boxes with the dial. You know, you dialed the combination number to get into the boxes. So we used to play post office with that a lot of the time. Her brothers and sisters and my sister and I played together. And we lived only a block from the school, both when I was in elementary and out at Grand Harbor. And we could walk over to the school, swing. There were enough kids around, you could play a game of softball, kick the can, that kind of games. Last couple out.
What's that?
Oh, you line up in couples, 2 by 2 by 2, and then one person calls last couple out, and the last couple at the end of the game have to run, and you try to catch one or the other. If you catch one, they become it, and you become a couple. The other two become a couple. We used to play that a lot. Oftentimes did it like in school too for exercise. I think probably they did it at dances too, I don't know. When I went to school in Grand Harbor, and I loved that school, there were 4 grades in a room, and there were 4 or 5 of us in every grade, and we always got to have good roles in the Christmas programs, Mother's Day programs, and the teachers were neighbor girls that lived quite close. And they drove over to the school every day. They didn't stay there. And there, you felt like home because there were older kids and younger kids, and we all played together. And one of them could play, they had an old pump organ in the school. We didn't have a piano. We had that pump organ. And she'd play the pump organ in the wintertime when we couldn't go out. We used to dance, you know, folk dances and dances like that for exercise during the recess time. That one was like all one, one big family. When I went to school at the public school in Devil's Lake, we had 3 or 4 rooms of every grade. And so there were so many of us that, like for the Christmas program, all you'd be is in the chorus, just stand there all the time. You never ever got a leading role, to do anything or ever get out and do anything. So that's why when I went to that other school, the consolidated one, I thought it was so great. I had such a good time. And I loved my teacher. She was a real good person, good to the children. So it was a fun time. When my sister came home, she started the public school, and she told my mother she had kind of a speech impediment. And my mother said, well, how was school today? How many are there? And she said there were 44 girls and 44 boys. And my mother said, oh, that's an awfully big classroom. Are you sure, she said, she had 44 girls and 44 boys? Yes, there were 44 girls and 44 boys. Then she found out there were 44 girls in all of the first grade and 44 boys, but they were in different classrooms. It wasn't, and I think what the teacher had said is there were 44 girls and boys, and she thought there were 44 of each, but actually there were 44 in all. But that, when I went there to school, it was departmentalized for 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And I don't like to be departmentalized for grade children. I never have. We had one teacher that taught all of the 4th, 5th, and 6th graders their English. We had one teacher that taught math. And the teacher, I had an excellent teacher and an excellent way to do it. But you didn't learn to borrow, you learned to add at the bottom number. If you never went to a different teacher and had, or a different school and had that way of doing subtracting, it's great. But when I went to college and had to learn how to borrow as an adult, it really, I'm confused even to this day. I can't remember. Do I borrow? Do I add? Which one do I do? But we all had the same, we all learned to do it the same way because she taught all of them all day long. She taught math classes. And the other one taught whatever class they had. We had 6 periods in a day, and then we had different recess times. And when we'd have to come in, they'd ring the bell. And one day I was out playing, and I was playing with somebody in a lower grade, and all of a sudden the bell, I thought the bell rang, and I got in line, and I realized, oh, these were different children, different grades. I was the only one from my group out there, and they had already started the class upstairs because they didn't realize that they thought I was missing for the day. So I was just playing and didn't hear my bell ring on the playground. So I always thought, oh, you're just more like a number. You're not really an individual. In a smaller classroom, they would have said, well, where is this child? Why isn't she in here? And yes, I think you get more personal attention. I still have some of the gifts I got for Christmas from my 1st grade teacher. And that 8th grade teacher, I still have I got a box of pencils with my name on them, and I still have them. I've never once used them. Go in the box. That it?
Well, do you have anything else you'd like to tell us about school?
I don't think so. I think I've talked enough.
Would you like to take a break?
No, do you have another question?
I have some
Okay.
more. Did you have a lot of homework when you were in school?
We had homework. I don't remember any homework in 1st and 2nd grade. Probably not, because my parents weren't college graduates or anything. And at the public school, I don't remember. I know I had some. But when I went to that academy, I had a lot of homework. I remember the teacher used to, and I don't understand it yet. Early in the morning, or when we came in the morning, the chalkboard was full of questions that we had to have a book that we wrote the questions down on. It wasn't a workbook, a printed workbook, and it wasn't part of a lesson. It was just questions. Some of them were on religion, some of them were on geography. There were 2 grades in a room there. So like I was there for 2nd and 3rd, so I was in 2 different rooms with different kids each year. But those questions, I remember I'd go over and ask my grandmother for help. My dad and mom would help me, and if they didn't know the answer, I went to Grandma, got help. And if Grandma didn't know it, sometimes Aunt Frances was there because she lived in town too. And all of us couldn't sometimes figure out some of the answers. And it wasn't related to anything we had during the day. I can see a child taking home, if you don't have your last 10 problems in math done, take it home and get it done. So you're caught up by when you come back the next day. And if you work at a slower pace, you need to maybe spend more time than somebody that whizzes through it in 2 minutes flat and is done. But I can't see anybody writing questions on a chalkboard that's not related to a subject you're teaching during the day. Just for something to do, for homework to do, I don't think that makes any sense. And I think a child that works 6 hours a day in school doesn't need another 3 hours of homework at home when they get home at night. They need some fun time, parent time, other things to do. That was my philosophy of homework. Even when I taught, I never ever assigned something, go home and look this up. Oh, maybe if it was a pronunciation of a word, or like an Indian tribe that had some interesting background. And some of the children had lots of things at home to work with. Some of the children didn't have anything. It's kind of like both of my grandchildren had, and I enjoyed it, but had classes when they were sophomores or juniors in high school that had to do their family history. Well, it was tough. Their parents worked with them already. They knew that they were going to have that assignment. They were working the year before to try to collect it. I tried collecting it. It was before I got my books from my family. And Joe's family yet doesn't have the book that you can go and find any reference to. And then when you'd go, and then they display them all in the school. They had a lovely day and invited all the grandparents. It was a wonderful day. But they'd have the whole halls just full of family histories. Well, the children, like my grandchildren, where the parents were both teachers, had big science boards filled with pictures, family pictures on both sides. And then you'd get to some child that didn't have anything. Maybe only had one parent and had one little scrap of cardboard standing up somewhere. That's not right either. It's harder on those children. So it's a good project. It was good for the children. They learned a lot. They kept it. The granddaughter took hers to the fair and got a first prize ribbon on it. Well, she had worked real hard. She had worked for 2 or 3 years on it to try to get all the information she could get. And both sets of grandparents tried to find out all they could find out because their family history. They took a book by Bob Newhart, and that was not the same Newhart family as their family, really. I think they maybe originally were, but it was a long ways back. It wasn't a lot of help, so they didn't have a whole lot of information. And if your parents are gone, you lose that information. It's too bad it's not all written down or on tape or somewhere. That's one thing my girls wanted to do and never did and regret, is that they didn't go to, my mother died when they were little. They were too little. Cindy doesn't even remember her, but Joe's grandmother, made all these homemade things and no recipe. She just went a pinch of this and a pinch of that. And Jolene kept saying that that the older granddaughters had gotten together because they had movie cameras and taken pictures of her making those things, and then they could refer back to it. They didn't get it done, and then she was gone, and now they never will get it done. They were even going to get together the last time they were home. Jolene wanted to get together with one of the other granddaughters that had lived in Towner by his mother and was there a lot. And she learned how to do it from Grandma. And so Jolene wanted to get pictures of her doing it. But that didn't work out either. When you get busy, everybody has a different life. It gets too late to do it.
Well, do you remember any of the foods that your mother made growing up? Any of the recipes?
Oh, yeah, I helped my mother a lot in the kitchen and learned how to make things that she made, most of the things she made. Some of the things I still don't know. I've been going to ask my sister. I don't know how she did it. She made either a beef roast or a pork roast, and then she had some tomato sauce or something in it, and she put cooked cabbage in it. And I don't know how she made that. I still don't. I've never kept trying. I suppose I'd probably figure out pretty much, but every once in a while. But Joe doesn't like Irish food. He doesn't like stew at all. And we used to have stew a lot. And my mother used to make lots of times she'd make a shortcake with biscuits. She made biscuits a lot because the Irish people eat a lot of biscuits, especially like in the morning. And Southerners do that too. We were at Thanksgiving at her house one time, and her mother-in-law came from the South, from Tennessee, and so she helped with the dinner. And when she got there, she brought along 4 cans of lovely string beans she had canned. She had gone to a farmer's market, got the string beans, and canned them, and they were lovely. Then we went shopping. She went to the grocery store, and she bought a chunk of fat pork, salt pork, about that big. She put the beans in the kettle and that pork in the middle of it, and she cooked those beans for 3 hours. String beans, 3 hours. Stephen always said she cooked them till there was no vitamin left in them. But they tasted good. They had absorbed that juice from the meat, and they were good. Then when we made Thanksgiving dinner, she made the gravy. I watched her make the gravy. I didn't watch her. I was setting the table. When we got dinner ready, I couldn't figure out what the lumps were in the gravy. You know, I would have strained it to get the lumps out. She had chopped up hard-cooked eggs and had them in her gravy. It was very good. But I had never had gravy like that before. That was new. She gets up every morning and makes a pan of cornbread in her frying pan. And then, like on Thanksgiving, she takes the cornbread and biscuits that she's baked for breakfast, the leftover ones, or she makes an extra big batch and puts them all together to make her cornbread dressing. That's how she makes the dressing. It's all very good, but it's very different from what my family has made. You have to grow up, I guess, with different kinds of food.
You said you helped your mother in the kitchen a lot. What were some of your chores that you had to do?
Oh, when we were little, we used to have to do the dishes. We took turns washing, one washed and one dried. And, I had to, when I came home from school, I had to go out always. My sister and I, we always did things together. We'd take a wagon or a sled and load it with chopped wood and coal and bring it in so that she would have it for her cook stove the next day. And then we didn't have running water in the house. We had running water in the milk house where we had dairy things to wash, but we didn't have running water in the house. Then we had to bring in like a couple 10-gallon cream cans of water so that she'd have water to cook with the next day. And then she'd had a reservoir on the back of that cook stove that you filled with water. So it was warm water to wash with or to work with if you were washing dishes or anything. So those are some of the chores that we always did.
How about laundry? Did you help with laundry?
The laundry? No. Mom did all the laundry, even when I was growing up, pretty much. She did the laundry, but when we lived at Grand Harbor, we didn't have electricity in the house either. We had kerosene lights and stuff. And Dad had taken her electric motor off of her machine and hooked it to a little pump motor. And she couldn't get it started, but I could. And so I used to walk home at recess and start the motor for her. And she had the washing machine in the pump house, or the place where we wash the separator, all of the milker things, because she had hot and cold running water over there. So it was easier to just to start the motor and wash there, carry your clothes over, than it was to have to carry the water in and out of the house. It made it easier for her. And she could use her washing machine that way by putting a different motor on it. She could have just bought a Maytag motor, I guess, that hooked right to it, but they never did. They just used a belt on the motor that was already in there standing, a stationary motor. So that's all we had to do was put the belt on and then start the little motor, and then she could do all her laundry.
Did you ever have to help your dad with any chores?
Not much. When they had the cows, the milk cows, I used to feed the calves, put milk in buckets and feed it to the calves. But other than that, we'd have to go out and get them from the pasture, walk them home. And he had sheep, and we used to have to help move the sheep from one pasture to another. But he always kept a goat with the sheep, because a goat you can make go, and the sheep will follow. They're much easier to follow than they are to try chasing. They don't chase well at all. So that's those. But the first thing I ever had to do when I moved on the farm, after, I was not familiar with farm. Well, I lived on my uncle's, stayed at my uncle's, but he always had a crew of hired men that went out. 6, 7 binders would go, or thrashing. He had his own crews for everything. But that first year we moved to the farm, we didn't have a very good crop, and my dad put the binder behind a tractor, and I was supposed to sit on the binder, which bound up those bundles to make shocks out of it. And I wasn't tall enough that I could reach. It was made for a man, and I was only a child, and I couldn't keep that pedal down. You had to hold that pedal down till the bundles all got in a row, or else you had to carry them. And I couldn't do it, and he was really cross with me, because then he went on the binder and I drove the tractor, and I'd turn it too short, and then I'd give him a bumpy ride going around the corners. He wasn't happy with that. But otherwise, we got it harvested. Was not my favorite thing, but it was kind of an itchy job to do during the day. But we never worked long days. We always quit when it got kind of dark, so it wasn't bad. My sister never had to do any of that, because she was a horsewoman. She could ride just like crazy, and she could do anything with a horse, and I never could. I couldn't even get him to the water trough to drink. And one day she wasn't home, she had gone somewhere, and when Dad would cultivate the potatoes, she would ride the horse. He'd take one horse, a workhorse, on the potato cultivator, and she could go down just perfect with the horse and bring it back. I couldn't. I had the horse on all the potato plants, and when she came home, my mother said, "Hurry up and get down there, he's going to kill her." She's plowing out all the potatoes with that horse. Oh, was I ever glad when she got there, because I could not do anything with a horse. I love horses, but I sure can't handle them. They know it too. They know immediately that you're not good, because I was falling off one side and then falling off the other side instead of staying where I belonged on the middle of the horse. And I wasn't old enough. I could not have handled the cultivator. That took some strength to hold it in place, get the weeds out.
What other animals did you keep? Did you have any pets?
Oh, we always had a pet. When we lived in town, we had a reddish brown colored rat terrier, or a terrier of some kind. She was fairly good size and really horribly overweight, because everybody fed her. We named her Rosie, and we had her until Rosie got old and died. And then my uncle gave us a little tiny puppy terrier, and we took that everywhere. It was just that never did get very big. It's really a small dog. But and then on the farm, that's why we liked farming. My mother wanted to move back to town, because it was easier for her. She didn't have the dirty clothes and the work that we had on the farm. But we had banty roosters, a bunch of banty roosters that laid little eggs and hatched these little banty chickens. And we had cats and dogs, and horses. We always had a Shetland pony. And several times we had it bred. We had little baby Shetlands, but we never had good luck with them living very long. We lost, I don't know, if they do something to those horses to make them smaller, or if they're inbred. But we didn't have good luck with those. We had colts with big horses, but we didn't have good luck with colts with those Shetlands for some reason. And they're mean. They're little, but they're mean. They can be real mean to ride. And where we lived in Grand Harbor, it was this town site, and the kids would go through and they'd tease the animals
And that makes them mean too. Then they chase them, and then when they do something wrong, then it's the animal's fault. I remember they'd go in the barn sometimes when the horses were tied up and pester the horses. Just be mean to them in the barn. And they didn't think they were doing anything wrong, but it's not comfortable for the horse or for any pet to be mishandled. But we always had pets. That's why we liked it in the country. Dad liked it. We liked it. It was only poor Mom. She never had a choice. My sister loves animals too, of all kinds.
Do you remember anything else about chores or things you had to do?
Chores?
Yeah. Or
Well, not really. It was just a given that we had to do it. But I don't remember that,